The sharp crack of the judge's gavel didn't just end a 10-year marriage. It shattered Samantha's entire reality. Standing in the sterile, mahogany-lined courtroom, she was stripped of her dignity, her life's work, and every dime she had helped build. Across the aisle, her ex-husband smirked, adjusting his bespoke silk tie before whispering that she was nothing but a worthless charity case. He thought he had buried her beneath ironclad contracts and high-priced lawyers. He thought she would quietly disappear into the gutters of Chicago. He was wrong, because the man watching quietly from the gallery was about to rewrite the rules of the game. The air in courtroom 3B of the Cook County Domestic Relations Division smelled faintly of lemon polish and shattered promises. Samantha Hayes sat rigidly at the defendant's table, her knuckles white as she gripped the edges of a scuffed leather binder. Beside her, her attorney, a chronically overworked woman named Brenda Higgins, shuffled through a stack of heavily redacted bank statements, her sigh carrying the heavy weight of defeat. Across the center aisle sat Richard Sterling. Richard looked as though he were waiting for a table at a Michelin-starred restaurant, rather than finalizing the dissolution of a decade-long partnership. He wore a charcoal Tom Ford suit that clung perfectly to his broad shoulders, his dark hair immaculately styled. Beside him sat his bulldog of a lawyer, David Carmichael, a man whose hourly rate was more than Samantha's current net worth. And sitting in the gallery, exactly 2 rows behind Richard, was Chloe Davis. Chloe, 24, a former junior analyst at Richard's firm, and the woman whose accidental pregnancy had been the catalyst for this agonizing 6-month legal bloodbath. Given the stipulations of the prenuptial agreement signed on October 14, 2015, Judge Penelope Reyes droned, her glasses perched low on her nose as she read the final decree. And the lack of substantiating evidence regarding the plaintiff's alleged offshore assets in the Cayman Islands, this court finds no legal basis to grant spousal support to the respondent, Mrs. Sterling. Now, Ms. Hayes. Samantha closed her eyes. The words felt like physical blows. Lack of substantiating evidence. She had built Sterling Real Estate Holdings from the ground up alongside Richard. When they were 22 and eating ramen on a mattress on the floor, it was Samantha who had stayed up until 4 a.m., drafting the zoning proposals that won them their first major commercial plot. It was Samantha who had mapped out the logistics, schmoozed the city councilman, and balanced the impossibly tight ledgers. Richard was simply the face, the charismatic, golden-tongued salesman who shook the hands and cut the ribbons. But when it came time to incorporate, Richard had insisted on putting everything in his name. For tax purposes. When they married, he had handed her a prenup the night before the wedding, laughing it off as a formality required by his new investors. She had trusted him. She had loved him. Furthermore, Judge Reyes continued, her voice devoid of emotion, the primary residence located in Lincoln Park shall remain the sole property of the plaintiff. Ms. Hayes is ordered to vacate the premises within 48 hours. The joint checking account containing the remaining balance of $8,000 shall be split evenly. This court is adjourned. Crack. The gavel fell. $4,000. 10 years of her life. Millions of dollars in acquired real estate. And she was walking away with $4,000 and 48 hours to pack her bags. Samantha stood slowly, her legs feeling like lead. Brenda offered a sympathetic, tight-lipped smile. "I'm sorry, Sam. We tried. He just buried the money too deep, and Carmichael is a shark. If we appeal, it'll take years and hundreds of thousands of dollars you don't have." "I know, Brenda. Thank you," Samantha whispered, her voice hollow. As Brenda packed her briefcase and hurried off to her next case, Samantha was left alone at the table. She began gathering her files, pointless printouts of shell companies she knew Richard owned, but couldn't legally tie to him. Need a garbage bag for those? Samantha froze. She didn't need to look up to recognize the arrogant, silken baritone. Richard strolled over to her table, buttoning his suit jacket. Carmichael was already walking out the double doors, leaving the two of them relatively alone in the cavernous room. Samantha kept her eyes on her documents. "Go to hell, Richard." Richard chuckled, a low, cruel sound that made her stomach turn. He leaned closer, resting his manicured hands on her table. "You really thought you could outsmart me, Sam. You thought you could walk into a courtroom and claim half of my empire." "It's our empire," she snapped, finally looking up. Her amber eyes blazed with a mixture of grief and pure, unadulterated rage. "I wrote the Oakville proposal. I secured the downtown high-rise permits. You wouldn't know a zoning variance from a hole in the ground." "Maybe," Richard sneered, his smile entirely devoid of warmth. "But my name is on the deed, sweetheart. And yours is nowhere. You were a glorified secretary I let share my bed. And now, you're just a parasite I've successfully excised." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "You're walking out of here with the clothes on your back. Good luck paying for the subway, Sam. I'll be sure to wave when Chloe and I drive past you in the Bentley." With a final, mocking wink, Richard turned on his heel and strode down the aisle. Chloe stood up from the gallery, practically bouncing on her heels, and threw her arms around Richard's neck, pressing a kiss to his cheek before casting a triumphant, pitying glare in Samantha's direction. Samantha stood perfectly still until the heavy oak doors swung shut behind them. Only then did the first tear break free, tracking hot and fast down her cheek. She hastily wiped it away. She would not cry for him. Not anymore. But as she picked up her bag and walked out of the courtroom, the sheer gravity of her situation crashed down upon her. She was 32 years old, virtually unemployable in her field, thanks to Richard's vicious whisper campaigns among Chicago's elite developers, and she had exactly $4,000 to her name. The rain in Chicago was unforgiving that November. It slanted sideways, biting and cold, matching the bleakness of Samantha's new reality. Her 48 hours had passed in a blur of cardboard boxes and packing tape. She had left the sprawling, custom-built Lincoln Park mansion and moved into a cramped, fourth-floor walk-up in a decaying building on the fringes of the South Loop. The radiator clanked aggressively throughout the night, yet the room remained perpetually freezing. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing layers of decades-old floral patterns, and the single window overlooked a brick wall and a dumpster. Samantha sat on the edge of a mattress she had bought second-hand off the internet, staring at the glowing screen of her battered laptop. "We regret to inform you. While your qualifications are impressive, at this time we are moving forward with other candidates. 14 rejections in 3 days." It made no sense. Her resume, even stripped of the official co-founder title that Richard had successfully, legally stripped from her, was immaculate. She had effectively run the operations of a $500 million real estate firm. She had applied for mid-level project management roles, then junior roles, and finally, administrative assistant positions. It wasn't until she received a call from an old acquaintance, a sympathetic HR director at a mid-sized firm, that she learned the truth. "Sam, it's Clara," the voice had whispered through the phone yesterday. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but you need to know. Richard sent out a blind email to the partners at every major firm in the tri-state area. He claimed you were terminated for corporate espionage and embezzlement. He said he declined to press charges out of pity, but warned everyone that hiring you is a massive liability." Samantha had dropped the phone. Richard wasn't just satisfied with taking her past. He was actively destroying her future. He wanted her starved out. He wanted her crawling back to him, begging for a handout, just so he could watch her suffer. She looked at her banking app. $2,850. First and last month's rent had taken a massive chunk. Groceries, a cheap prepaid phone plan, subway fare. It was draining faster than she could comprehend. Desperation began to claw at her throat. She couldn't afford a lawyer to sue him for defamation. She couldn't get a job in her industry. She was completely boxed in. Wrapping a thick wool cardigan tightly around herself, Samantha opened a heavily encrypted folder on her desktop. It was labeled Oakville. The Oakville project was Richard's current crown jewel. It was a massive, multi-use commercial and residential development slated for the waterfront. It was projected to bring in hundreds of millions. But what Richard didn't know, what nobody knew except Samantha, was that the entire project was built on a house of cards. Before the divorce had turned nuclear, Samantha had discovered a critical flaw in the environmental survey of the Oakville land. There was an underground aqueduct system that had been improperly documented by the city in the 1920s. If Richard broke ground where he planned, the structural integrity of the high-rises would be compromised, leading to a catastrophic collapse and endless litigation. Samantha had spent months designing a highly complex architectural bypass, a way to reroute the foundation without losing square footage. She had never given Richard those blueprints. When she found out about Chloe, she had locked the files away. Richard was moving forward with the original flawed design, completely oblivious. Samantha stared at the screen. She could let him fail. She could sit back and watch Sterling Holdings crumble into the waterfront. But his failure wouldn't pay her rent. It wouldn't clear her name. There was only one man in Chicago who had the capital, the ruthlessness, and the motive to use this information. Alexander Blackwood was a myth as much as a man. He was the CEO of Blackwood Enterprises, a multi-billion-dollar global conglomerate that had recently set its sights on Chicago real estate. He was known in the industry as the Undertaker because he exclusively bought distressed, failing properties and swallowed rival firms whole. He was Richard's biggest competitor, and recently Richard had outbid Blackwood for the Oakville land, a victory Richard had bragged about endlessly. Samantha printed the architectural bypass blueprints, rolled them into a waterproof tube, and threw on her trench coat. She had no appointment. She had no leverage other than the genius in her head. But she had nothing left to lose. The Blackwood Enterprises building was a monolith of black glass and steel that pierced the gloomy Chicago skyline. Inside, the lobby was a cavern of Italian marble and hushed efficiency. Samantha, dripping wet from the walk from the subway station, approached the imposing semicircular reception desk. "I need to see Alexander Blackwood," Samantha said, trying to keep her teeth from chattering. The receptionist, a perfectly polished woman in a sharp navy suit, barely looked up from her monitor. "Do you have an appointment, Miss Hayes, Samantha Hayes?" "And no, I don't. But I have information regarding the Oakville waterfront development that Mr. Blackwood will want to see immediately." The receptionist offered a tight, patronizing smile. "Mr. Blackwood does not take unannounced meetings. If you'd like to leave your contact information, his administrative team can review your request." "You don't understand," Samantha pressed, leaning over the counter, leaving a wet handprint on the pristine marble. "If you don't call up to his office right now, he's going to lose his only window to acquire the Oakville property." "Security," the receptionist said sharply into her headset. Two large men in dark suits immediately detached themselves from the shadows near the elevator banks and began walking toward her. Panic flared in Samantha's chest. "No, wait, please!" She stepped back, her heel catching on the slick, wet marble floor. She stumbled backward, losing her grip on the waterproof tube. The plastic cap popped off as it hit the ground, and the large, intricate blueprints spilled out, unrolling halfway across the floor. "Ma'am, you need to leave the premises," one of the security guards said, reaching out to grab her arm. "Don't touch me," Samantha snapped, dropping to her knees to scramble for the wet blueprints. She felt utterly humiliated. She was a beggar on the floor of her enemy's rival. "Let her go." The voice was not loud, but it cut through the vast lobby like a steel blade. It possessed an immediate, unquestionable authority that brought the security guards to a dead halt. Samantha looked up from the floor. A man had stepped out of a private, gold-trimmed elevator. He was tall, perhaps 6'3", with an athletic build, completely disguised by an impeccably tailored midnight blue suit. His hair was dark, threaded with the faintest traces of silver at the temples, and his jawline looked as though it had been chiseled from the marble beneath their feet. But it was his eyes that arrested her, a piercing, cold, calculating grey that seemed to take in the entire room, categorize it, and own it in a fraction of a second. Alexander Blackwood. He didn't look at the security guards. His eyes were locked on the blueprints, scattered across the floor. Slowly he walked over, his leather shoes clicking methodically against the stone. He crouched down, remarkably fluid in his expensive suit, and picked up the edge of the large paper. Samantha held her breath as he scanned the complex architectural schematics. His eyes narrowed slightly. He traced a finger over the red-inked bypass designs she had painstakingly drawn. "This is the Oakville grid," Alexander said, his voice a low, resonant baritone. He looked up, his grey eyes pinning her in place. "But these foundations are entirely rerouted. Why?" "Because," Samantha said, pushing herself up to her feet, ignoring the dampness of her skirt, "the city's 1928 aqueduct survey was off by 60 yards. The western edge of the bedrock is unstable. If a structure weighing more than 20,000 tons is built on the current coordinates, it will sink 3 inches in the first year and ultimately fracture." Alexander stood up, still holding her blueprint. He looked from the paper to her face. He noted her soaked coat, the dark circles under her eyes, and the fierce, unyielding pride burning beneath it all. "And Richard Sterling is building on the current coordinates," Alexander stated. It wasn't a question. "He is," Samantha confirmed, lifting her chin. "He plans to break ground next month. When he does, he'll hit the water table. The EPA will shut him down, his investors will panic, and the bank will call in the loans. Sterling Holdings will be over-leveraged and bleeding cash." A slow, dangerous smile curved the corner of Alexander's mouth. "And you designed the bypass to save the project, yet you didn't give it to him." "We recently finalized our divorce," Samantha said flatly, keeping her voice devoid of the humiliation that threatened to choke her. "He took the company. He took the credit. I kept the brains." Alexander studied her for a long, silent moment. The lobby was completely still. Even the receptionist seemed to have stopped breathing. Alexander Blackwood was known to be a man of few words and rapid, brutal decisions. "You're Samantha," he finally said. She blinked, surprised. "You know who I am?" "I know that Sterling Real Estate Holdings didn't turn a profit until you married Richard. I know that the flawless logistics of his last 5 acquisitions had your fingerprints all over them, even if he paraded in front of the cameras." Alexander rolled the blueprint back up with agonizing precision. "And I know that Richard recently sent a highly defamatory email to my board of directors, claiming you are an embezzler." Samantha felt her stomach plummet. "It's a lie. He's trying to starve me out of the industry." "I am aware," Alexander said coldly. "Richard Sterling is an arrogant fool who mistakes his own reflection for the sun. He couldn't successfully embezzle $1 from a lemonade stand without leaving a paper trail." He turned to the security guards. "Return to your posts." He looked at the receptionist. "Cancel my 2 o'clock." Finally, he turned back to Samantha, extending the rolled-up blueprint toward her. When she reached out to take it, he didn't let go immediately. "My office is on the 65th floor, Miss Hayes," Alexander said, his gaze intense. "I suggest you follow me. We have a great deal of money to discuss, and a mutual enemy to destroy." Samantha looked at his hand, then up to his grey eyes. For the first time in 6 months, she didn't feel the crushing weight of victimhood. She felt the sharp, intoxicating thrill of war. She let go of the blueprint, allowing him to carry it, and fell into step beside him as they walked toward the private elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing out the cold, wet world, and beginning a partnership that would shake the very foundations of the city. The elevator doors opened onto the 65th floor, revealing a sprawling office that felt less like a corporate workspace and more like the apex of a modern fortress. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, storm-swept view of the Chicago skyline, the dark waters of Lake Michigan churning violently in the distance. The room was anchored by a massive desk carved from a single slab of obsidian, and the walls were lined with rare, leather-bound first editions and subtle, original expressionist paintings. Alexander Blackwood walked to a crystal decanter resting on a mahogany side table. He poured 2 measures of amber liquid, the ice clinking sharply in the heavy crystal tumblers. "Macallan 25, Alexander said, turning and offering a glass to Samantha. "You look like you need it." Samantha took the glass, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to the icy rain that had chilled her to the bone. She took a slow sip, the scotch burning a trail of fire down her throat, grounding her. "Let me be perfectly clear about your situation, Miss Hayes," Alexander began, leaning back against the edge of his obsidian desk, his long legs crossed at the ankles. "I had my intelligence team look into Richard's recent maneuvers. He hasn't just blacklisted you. He has filed a preemptive corporate injunction. He claims that during your embezzlement, you stole proprietary algorithms and trade secrets. If I hire you as a consultant, he will immediately file a restraining order against Blackwood Enterprises, citing corporate espionage. It would tie the Oakville acquisition up in litigation for 3 to 5 years. Samantha's grip on the glass tightened until her knuckles turned white. He's bluffing. He has zero proof. There was no embezzlement, and the algorithms were my own intellectual property. In the American justice system, proof is secondary to capital, Alexander replied smoothly. He has Vanguard and Apollo Global Management backing his current expansion. He can afford to bleed you dry in court. I, on the other hand, do not have the patience to wait 3 years for a judge to dismiss a frivolous lawsuit. I want Oakville now. Then use the blueprints, Samantha said, gesturing to the waterproof tube he had set on the desk. I'll sign them over to you. Just give me enough compensation to get out of Chicago and start over. Alexander's grey eyes darkened, the temperature in the room seeming to drop several degrees. You misunderstand me, Samantha. I don't just want the land. I want the total, unequivocal dismantling of Richard's empire. Men like him are a cancer in my city. And more importantly, my family has a very specific philosophy regarding those who steal what isn't theirs. He set his glass down and took a slow, deliberate step toward her. The air around him seemed to crackle with an ancient, predatory authority. Before my father brought our assets to the United States and legitimized them into real estate and equity, Alexander murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous, velvet octave. My grandfather ran the shipping docks in Palermo, Sicily. We were not born into boardrooms, Samantha. We were born into the syndicate. We survived by adhering to a strict code, an eye for an eye, and blood for blood. We do not simply defeat our enemies. We make an example of them. Samantha's breath hitched. The rumors in the financial district had always painted the Blackwood family as ruthless, but the whispers of their old-world mafia ties were always dismissed as sensationalism. Looking into Alexander's eyes that held no fear and absolute control, she realized the rumors were true. She was standing in the den of a predator, far more lethal than Richard could ever hope to be. "If you walk away now with a small check," Alexander continued, his gaze pinning her, "Richard wins. He keeps his reputation, he keeps the company you built, and he believes he can crush anyone without consequence. I am offering you a different path. Retribution." "How?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You just said the injunction prevents me from working for you." "It prevents you from being my employee," Alexander corrected, a slow, calculated smile touching his lips. "It does not prevent you from being a principal equity holder in Blackwood Enterprises, and there is only one way to immediately transfer principal equity without triggering SEC red flags and board oversight committees." He reached into the inner pocket of his bespoke suit and withdrew a sleek, silver Cartier pen, laying it atop a heavy vellum document on his desk. "Marriage," Alexander stated simply. Samantha stared at him, her mind blanking. "You want me to marry you?" "A strategic alliance," he clarified, his tone strictly business, though his eyes never left hers. "Under a heavily fortified prenuptial agreement, of course. As my wife, your assets and intellectual property legally merge with the Blackwood Family Trust. The injunction Richard filed applies to competitors and former employees. It cannot legally be enforced against the spouse of a rival CEO operating under marital privilege and family trust protections. We use your bypass blueprints to silently buy the adjacent bedrock parcels through a shell company. We let Richard break ground. When he hits the aqueduct and the project collapses, we will be holding the only viable solution, and we will buy his debt for pennies on the dollar." "And what do you get out of this fake marriage, other than the Oakville land?" Samantha asked, her analytical mind fighting through the shock. "A partner who understands the architecture of the city better than anyone else," Alexander replied. "And frankly, a shield. The board of directors has been pressuring me to stabilize my public image. A respectable marriage to a brilliant woman achieves that. Once Richard is ruined and the acquisition is complete, we quietly dissolve the union. You will walk away with 20% of the Oakville profits. It will equate to roughly $40 million. $40 million. Her name cleared. Richard utterly destroyed by his own hubris. Samantha looked at the rain lashing against the glass. She thought of the cold, cramped apartment. She thought of Chloe's smug face in the courtroom and Richard's cruel laughter as he left her with nothing. Hard karma wasn't something you waited for the universe to deliver. It was something you built yourself. She walked to the desk, picked up the Cartier pen, and signed her name on the dotted line. "When do we start?" she asked. Alexander's smile reached his eyes this time. "We already have, Mrs. Blackwood. Let's get you out of those wet clothes. We have an empire to burn." 1 month later. The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was awash in the warm, golden glow of thousands of crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with the scent of imported white lilies, expensive perfumes, and the arrogant laughter of Chicago's elite. Waiters in white tuxedo jackets glided seamlessly through the crowd, balancing silver trays of beluga caviar and Dom Perignon. Tonight was the official, groundbreaking gala for the Oakville waterfront development, hosted by Sterling Real Estate Holdings. Richard stood at the center of the room, holding court like a conquering king. He was in his element, wearing a custom-tailored velvet dinner jacket, his teeth gleaming as he charmed a circle of local politicians and heavy-hitting investors. He had done it. Despite the whispers, despite the logistical nightmares of the past month, without Samantha's obsessive micromanagement, he had secured a massive $300 million mezzanine loan from Cerberus Capital Management to expedite the construction. He was highly leveraged, dangerously so, but the projected returns were astronomical. He was a visionary, a titan. Clinging tightly to his arm was Chloe. She wore a skin-tight, scarlet Givenchy gown that left little to the imagination. A massive 5-carat diamond engagement ring glittering obnoxiously on her left hand. She giggled at every joke Richard made, her eyes constantly scanning the room to ensure everyone was looking at them. "I have to say, Richard," slurred a red-faced managing director from Cerberus Capital, swirling his bourbon. "There were rumors that losing your ex-wife would slow you down. People said she was the brains of the operation." Richard offered a dismissive, patronizing chuckle. "People say a lot of things, Tom. The truth is, Samantha was a competent secretary who got delusions of grandeur. Once I removed the dead weight, Sterling Holdings finally found its true momentum. The Oakville project is going to redefine this city's skyline. We begin digging the foundation at dawn." "To the skyline!" Tom cheered, raising his glass. Across the room, the heavy mahogany double doors to the ballroom swung open. At first, only a few heads turned, but as the couple stepped over the threshold, a ripple of stunned silence spread outward, cutting through the jazz band's melody and the clinking of champagne flutes until a localized hush fell over the entrance. Samantha stood there, unrecognizable. Gone were the conservative, practical grey suits and the exhausted, tightly pulled-back hair she had worn during her marriage to Richard. Tonight, she was a weapon forged in silk and diamonds. She wore a breathtaking floor-length gown of midnight blue silk that draped perfectly over her curves, featuring a daring slit up the thigh and a plunging neckline. Her hair cascaded down her back in dark, voluminous waves, and around her neck rested a vintage, multi-million-dollar sapphire and diamond collar, a Blackwood family heirloom. But it wasn't just the clothes that commanded attention. It was the way she carried herself. Her posture was regal, her amber eyes cool, calculating, and utterly devoid of fear. She looked like a woman who owned the world. And standing beside her, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, was Alexander Blackwood. Alexander radiated an aura of lethal grace. He wore a traditional black tuxedo, but the fit was so precise and his demeanor so predatory that he made every other man in the room look like a child playing dress-up. The whispers ignited instantly. "Is that Samantha Hayes? What is she doing with the Undertaker? I heard she was living in a slum." Richard's smug smile vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine shock, followed quickly by a dark, ugly scowl. He handed his champagne glass to Chloe without looking at her, and aggressively pushed his way through the crowd toward the entrance. He intercepted Samantha and Alexander near a towering ice sculpture, his chest puffed out, attempting to reclaim his territory. "What the hell is this?" Richard hissed, keeping his voice low but laced with venom. "Security is supposed to be checking invitations. You don't belong here, Sam, and you certainly don't belong here with him." He shot a glare at Alexander. "Blackwood, slumming it with my leftovers? I knew your standards had dropped after I outbid you for Oakville, but this is pathetic, even for you." Alexander didn't blink. He didn't tense. He simply looked at Richard the way one might look at a cockroach on a marble floor, with mild disgust and a fleeting thought of how best to crush it. "I would choose your next words with extreme caution, Richard," Alexander said, his voice a low, terrifying purr that sent a chill down the spines of the nearby eavesdroppers. "Before you find yourself breathing through a tube." Richard laughed, a harsh, defensive sound. "Are you threatening me? In my own ballroom? I'll have you thrown out. And as for you," he turned his venom back to Samantha, "I don't know whose jewelry you rented, or what desperate lies you spun to get on his arm, but you're still a broke, unemployable fraud. Get out before I call the police." Samantha smiled. It was a slow, genuinely amused smile that completely unsettled Richard. "I don't think you'll be calling the police, Richard," Samantha said, her voice melodic, echoing slightly in the quiet bubble that had formed around them. "Not when you're heavily leveraged with Cerberus capital. They hate bad press. And forcibly removing your betters from a public gala isn't exactly the behavior of a stable CEO." "My betters?" Richard scoffed, his face reddening. "You have $4,000 to your name. You're nothing." Alexander smoothly shifted his stance, placing himself slightly in front of Samantha, a protective, territorial movement that was both subtle and overwhelmingly dominant. "You seem to be operating under a severe and frankly embarrassing misconception regarding the lady's status," Alexander said, his grey eyes locking onto Richard's panicked gaze. Richard sneered. "What status? She's my disgraced ex-wife." The corner of Alexander's mouth curled into a cruel, triumphant smirk. He reached for Samantha's left hand, gently lifting it for Richard to see. Resting on her ring finger was a flawless, 10-carat emerald-cut diamond set in platinum. "No, Richard," Alexander said, his voice ringing out clearly, ensuring that every investor, politician, and rival in the vicinity heard him perfectly. "She is my wife, and you have exactly 12 hours before your little empire sinks into the mud." The color drained completely from Richard's face. He stared at the diamond, then up at Samantha, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Behind them, the jazz band faltered, hitting a sour note, as the gravity of Alexander's words set the room ablaze with shock. The trap was sprung, and Richard Sterling had just walked right into the teeth of it. The morning sun rose over Lake Michigan, painting the Chicago skyline in violent shades of bruised purple and industrial gray. The freezing wind whipped off the water, but Richard didn't feel the cold. He stood at the perimeter of the Oakville site, a pristine white hard hat resting perfectly on his styled hair, surrounded by a swarm of local press, city council members, and heavily caffeinated investors. This was his moment, the moment he cemented his legacy and proved to the entire financial district that he didn't need Samantha. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice booming through a portable PA system, a triumphant, blinding smile plastered across his face. "Today we don't just break ground, we break the mold of what luxury and commercial integration can be in this great city. Sterling Real Estate Holdings is proud to usher in the future." He gestured grandly toward the center of the massive dirt lot. A fleet of enormous yellow Caterpillar, 336 excavators, and heavy-duty rotary drill rigs sat idling, their diesel engines rumbling like caged beasts. Richard caught the eye of his lead foreman, a grizzled veteran named Miller, and gave a sharp, definitive nod. Miller blew a whistle, and the machinery roared to life. The massive steel teeth of the excavators bit into the frozen earth. Flashbulbs popped from the press pool. Bloomberg News was streaming the event live. Richard practically vibrated with vindicated pride. Alexander's threat from the night before echoed in his mind, but he dismissed it as the desperate posturing of a man who had lost the bid. The first 20 feet of excavation went exactly according to the standard topographical maps. The drills ground through the topsoil and hit the Chicago clay. But at 60 feet, the narrative changed. A sudden, violently loud crack echoed across the site, a sound like a thunderclap detonating entirely underground. The earth beneath the central rotary rig violently shuddered. "Shut it down!" Miller screamed over the roar of the engines, waving his arms frantically from the edge of the pit. "Cut the power! Cut it!" But it was too late. The drill had pierced the crown of the undocumented 1928 pressurized aqueduct system. With the retaining bedrock already compromised by the heavy machinery above, the structural integrity failed completely. A terrifying geyser of pressurized, muddy water erupted from the earth, shooting 80 feet into the air. It wasn't just a leak, it was a subterranean flood of biblical proportions. The water blasted upward with the force of an explosive charge, showering the press pool, the investors, and Richard in a rain of freezing, filthy mud. Panic erupted. The ground beneath the 40-ton Caterpillar excavator began to liquefy, turning the solid clay into a treacherous sinkhole in seconds. The massive machine tilted precariously, its operator scrambling out of the cabin and diving into the mud just as the earth gave way, swallowing the excavator half whole into the rising muddy lake. "What is happening?" an executive from Cerberus Capital shouted, slipping in the rapidly spreading mud, his expensive wool coat ruined. "The water table," Miller yelled, pulling a terrified reporter back from the collapsing ledge. "We hit a high-pressure main! The whole foundation is washing out." Richard stood frozen, his pristine suit caked in dark, freezing sludge. The deafening roar of the water rushing into his multi-million-dollar foundation sounded exactly like the tearing of his empire. His phone began to vibrate violently in his pocket. He pulled it out with shaking, mud-slicked fingers. It was Tom, the managing director of Cerberus Capital. "You son of a bitch!" Tom's voice roared through the receiver, completely devoid of his usual corporate polish. "I am watching the Bloomberg feed. You hit a pressurized aqueduct. The environmental surveys you gave us explicitly stated the bedrock was solid to 200 feet. Tom, please, it's an anomaly," Richard stammered, his charismatic facade crumbling into sheer terror. "It's fraud," Tom screamed. "The EPA has already been notified. They are slapping a Class 1 environmental hazard injunction on the site in 20 minutes. You are in breach of our loan covenants, Richard. We are freezing your credit lines immediately, and we are calling in the mezzanine loan, all 300 million of it. You have 48 hours to pay us back, or we take the holding company." The line went dead. Richard dropped the phone. It sank into the mud at his feet. The sirens began to wail in the distance, a chaotic symphony of police, fire departments, and environmental protection agencies descending upon the disaster. The journalists were no longer taking pictures of a triumphant CEO. They were documenting the catastrophic, negligent collapse of a multi-million-dollar development. He had ignored the warnings. He had assumed Samantha's warnings were just bitterness. He had assumed Alexander's threat was a bluff. By noon, the Oakville site was surrounded by yellow hazard tape. By 2 p.m., Sterling Real Estate Holdings stock had plummeted by 68%. By 5 p.m., Richard was sitting alone in his penthouse, the silence deafening. The front door opened, and Chloe walked in. She was wearing her mink coat and carrying 2 oversized Louis Vuitton duffel bags. Richard looked up, his eyes bloodshot, a glass of cheap whiskey trembling in his hand. "Chloe, what are you doing?" She didn't look at him with sympathy. She looked at him with the cold, calculating disdain of a survivor abandoning a sinking ship. "I'm leaving, Richard. Leaving. But I need you," he pleaded, the arrogance entirely stripped from his voice. "We can fight this. I just need to find new investors." "You're radioactive," Chloe interrupted, her voice sharp and nasal. "My lawyer's called. The SEC is opening an investigation into your loan applications. You're going to federal prison, Richard. and I am not spending my 20s visiting you behind plexiglass. Oh, and by the way, there is no baby. It was a false positive. Good luck with the bankruptcy." She turned on her heel, her stilettos clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, and walked out the door, leaving Richard utterly, spectacularly alone in the ruins of his own making. 2 weeks later, the storm had finally passed, leaving nothing but absolute devastation in its wake. The main boardroom on the 65th floor of Blackwood Enterprises was an exercise in intimidating minimalism. The air was meticulously climate-controlled, cool and faintly smelling of expensive leather and citrus polish. A massive, single-slab obsidian table dominated the center of the room, gleaming flawlessly under the recessed lighting. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city of Chicago moved on under a crisp, unforgiving winter sky, utterly indifferent to the corporate execution about to take place within these walls. Richard sat alone at the far end of the long table. He looked entirely diminished, a hollowed-out shell of the Titan who had stood at the Oakville site just 14 days prior. He had lost at least 15 pounds. His custom-tailored charcoal suit, once a symbol of his armor, now hung loosely on his shrinking frame, emphasizing the sharp, defeated slope of his shoulders. The dark, bruised circles under his eyes spoke of endless, agonizing, sleepless nights, fending off furious creditors, relentless federal investigators, and panicked board members. Cerberus Capital had wasted no time. The moment the EPA had slapped the Class 1 environmental hazard injunction on the flooded site, Cerberus had forced Sterling Real Estate Holdings into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Richard's personal assets were frozen. His immaculate reputation was incinerated, replaced by headlines dubbing him the architect of the city's most expensive mud puddle. Worse still, the SEC had formally opened an investigation into his loan applications, and he was staring down the barrel of multiple counts of corporate fraud. His only way out, the only microscopic loophole to keep himself out of a federal penitentiary, was a distressed asset buyout. He had to completely surrender the entirely devalued Sterling holdings, including the ruined Oakville land, to whoever held his debt. He was waiting for the axe to fall. The heavy mahogany double doors at the end of the room finally clicked open. Alexander walked in first. He did not rush, exuding the calm, terrifying power of an apex predator, returning to a fresh, inevitable kill. He wore a stark black suit, his expression unreadable, his grey eyes sweeping the room and pinning Richard with a look of absolute, glacial apathy. But Alexander did not take the seat at the head of the table. Instead, he stopped, turned, and held the heavy leather chair out for the person walking in behind him. Samantha stepped over the threshold. If Richard had expected to see a woman gloating, or perhaps carrying the lingering bitterness of their divorce, he was sorely mistaken. She wore a sharp, impeccably tailored ivory power suit that contrasted starkly with the dark aesthetic of the room, her dark hair falling in loose, confident waves over her shoulders. She carried a single, slim manila folder. But it was her face that truly broke Richard's spirit. She didn't look angry. She didn't look vengeful. She looked completely, utterly, and devastatingly unbothered. She looked at him the way one might look at a misfiled piece of paperwork, a mild inconvenience that was about to be corrected. Samantha walked to the head of the table and sat down, placing the folder smoothly on the obsidian surface. Alexander took the seat to her immediate right, leaning back, crossing his arms, and watching the proceedings with dark, silent amusement. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Richard's hands trembled where they rested on his lap. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. "Sam," Richard whispered, the sound cracking pitifully in the vast room. It was a desperate, pathetic plea from a man who had suddenly realized he was out of lifelines. "Please." Samantha didn't blink. She opened the folder with steady, deliberate hands. "It's Mrs. Blackwood in this building, Richard," she corrected, her voice smooth, melodic, and entirely devoid of any lingering affection or shared history. She looked down at the top sheet of paper. "Let's review the current, disastrous valuation of Sterling Real Estate Holdings. As of this morning, the Oakville site requires a baseline of $40 million in environmental cleanup before the city will even consider lifting the injunction or allowing the parcel to be sold. You owe Cerberus Capital $300 million, a loan you secured using fabricated topographical data. You owe your various contractors and suppliers a combined $22 million. Furthermore, your personal assets are so heavily leveraged against the holding company that the bank is foreclosing on the Lincoln Park estate by Friday." She looked up, her amber eyes locking onto his bloodshot ones. There was no warmth there, just the cold, hard arithmetic of reality. "You're not just broke, Richard. You are a financial black hole. You are millions of dollars beneath the poverty line." Richard gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. His chest heaved as he grasped at the very last, frayed threads of his shattered ego. "I built that company," he choked out, his voice thick with a mixture of grief and denial. "We were 22, Sam. We started with nothing. I brought in the clients. I built the brand." "No," Samantha said firmly, the absolute truth ringing like a bell in the quiet room. She didn't raise her voice, but the weight of her words practically pressed him into his chair. "I built that company. I did the math. I managed the logistics. I secured the zoning. You just wore the expensive suits, smiled for the cameras, and signed the checks I put in front of you. And the moment I left, the moment you decided you were too brilliant to need the woman who built your foundation, you drove my company straight into the bedrock because you couldn't read a topographical map to save your own life." Richard lowered his head, his gaze dropping to the polished black table. He had no defense. He had no leverage. He couldn't spin this, and he couldn't charm his way out of it. He was entirely at her mercy. "Blackwood Enterprises has formally purchased your toxic debt from Cerberus Capital," Samantha continued, her tone shifting back to strict, unyielding business. "We absorbed the risk for pennies on the dollar. We now hold all of your promissory notes. We own the mortgages to your properties. We effectively own the holding company." Alexander finally spoke, his deep, resonant voice slicing through the heavy air and drawing Richard's terrified gaze. "We already owned the adjacent parcels of land, Richard," Alexander stated, a slow, predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Samantha designed the bypass months ago. We have the blueprints to stabilize the site, drain the water table, and build the high-rises safely without touching the aqueduct. We are going to build the empire you promised the city, and we are going to do it standing on the graveyard of your reputation." Richard closed his eyes. The sheer scale of his outmaneuvering was staggering. He hadn't just been beaten, he had been orchestrated. Samantha reached into the inner pocket of her ivory suit jacket and withdrew a crisp, rectangular piece of paper. She placed it flat on the table and, with 2 fingers, slid it smoothly across the long expanse of obsidian. It glided silently, coming to a dead stop exactly in front of Richard's trembling hands. He slowly opened his eyes and looked down at it. It was a certified cashier's check, drawn from the Blackwood Family Trust. "What is this?" he asked, his voice entirely hollow, sounding like a man speaking from the bottom of a well. "That is the official buyout sum for your remaining, heavily diluted shares of Sterling Real Estate Holdings," Samantha explained, leaning back in her chair. "It is legally binding. Once you sign the transfer documents in that folder, you surrender all rights to the company and the Oakville land. In exchange, you walk away completely free of the Cerberus debt. More importantly, the SEC will drop the federal fraud charges, because Blackwood Enterprises is absorbing the corporate liability. Richard stared at the number printed clearly on the check. His breath hitched sharply in his throat. His eyes darted across the zeros, his mind struggling to process the absolute poetry of his ruin. It was a check for exactly $4,000. $4,000, Richard whispered. A single tear of absolute, crushing humiliation finally broke free, trailing hot and fast down his pale cheek. He didn't bother to wipe it away. That's nothing. It's exactly what you left me with, Samantha replied. Her voice dropped to a fierce, unrelenting whisper that carried across the room like a physical strike. You stood in a courtroom and told me I was walking out with nothing but the clothes on my back. You mocked me. You told me to use my share for subway fare. She leaned forward slightly, resting her forearms on the table, owning the space, owning the moment, owning him. I suggest you take your own advice, Richard. The train runs every 15 minutes. Richard looked at the check, then up at Alexander's cold, unforgiving stare. Finally, his eyes settled back on Samantha, the woman he had underestimated, betrayed, discarded, and actively tried to destroy. She had not just returned to survive. She had returned to conquer. With a violently shaking hand, Richard reached out and picked up the heavy silver Blackwood Enterprises pen resting beside the folder. He flipped to the signature page. He didn't read the fine print. It didn't matter anymore. He signed his name on the transfer documents, his signature a jagged, messy scrawl, officially signing away a decade of his life's work for $4,000. He stood up, clutching the small paper check in his fist. His shoulders were slumped, his head bowed. He looked like a ghost, a mere echo of the man he had been just weeks prior. He didn't say another word. There were no words left. He turned and walked out of the boardroom, his footsteps echoing softly until the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind him, sealing his fate forever. Samantha sat in the profound silence for a long moment, staring at the freshly signed documents. The heavy, suffocating weight she had been carrying in her chest for 6 agonizing months. The betrayal, the boiling anger, the paralyzing fear of poverty, finally lifted. It dissipated into the sleek, conditioned air of the office, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. Beside her, Alexander reached over, his large, warm hand covering hers where it rested on the table. The sudden contact sent a jolt of electricity through her. She turned her head to look at him, the lethal, calculating businessman who had offered her a weapon when the rest of the world had handed her a shovel was watching her. The icy, predatory guard he kept up for the world had melted away, leaving a rare, genuine softness in his striking grey eyes. "The city is ours," Alexander murmured, his thumb gently tracing the line of her knuckles. Samantha looked down at their hands, then slowly turned hers over, deliberately interlacing her fingers with his. It had started as a devil's bargain, a transactional, fake marriage designed for mutual destruction and corporate gain. But as she looked at him now, feeling the absolute security, the mutual respect, and the formidable power radiating from him, she realized that the contract they had signed was no longer just business. A slow, radiant smile spread across Samantha's face, reaching all the way to her amber eyes. "Then let's get to work," she said. "True power isn't found in loud declarations or stolen credit. It is built quietly, meticulously, in the shadows." Richard believed his arrogance was a shield, completely blind to the fact that karma is an architect with infinite patience. He took everything from Samantha, leaving her with a paltry $4,000 and a ruined name. In return, she weaponized her brilliance, found a partner whose ruthlessness matched her resilience, and systematically dismantled Richard's world until he was left holding that exact same sum. The universe demands balance, and those who build their castles on the stolen labor of others will inevitably watch them sink into the mud. Samantha didn't just reclaim her life, she upgraded her empire, proving that the most dangerous mistake a man can make is leaving a brilliant woman with nothing to lose.